The 1990s of the last century are not called turbulent for nothing. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought countless misfortunes to the people living in its territory. However, on the other hand, it was also a time of opportunities, because domestic business was just beginning to emerge in those years. Active and ambitious citizens made real fortunes in the 1990s, even though entrepreneurship carried serious risks at that time. So how did businessmen live during the era of gangster showdowns and crimson jackets? What did they do, and what problems did they face first and foremost? Who most often went into entrepreneurship during the turbulent 90s, and how was business back then different from today's realities? That's what we'll talk about today. Let's get started. The 90s were a time of trials and hopes. The Soviet Union's collapse was one of the past century's most significant events. Along with clear benefits like freedom of speech and open borders, it also brought less positive outcomes for those living across 1/6 of the world's land. The rapid collapse of the vast country led to an economic meltdown of enormous scale, comparable only to the devastation after a war. It should be noted that the Soviet economy went into a deep nosedive back in the late 1980s, and its collapse was final. Thousands of enterprises stopped operating when it became clear no one wanted their products, even for free. Workers went months without receiving their salaries, pensioners didn't get their pensions or social benefits, and science, education, and culture became completely unnecessary to anyone. Huge numbers of people, especially the most vulnerable groups, were plunged into incredible poverty. Add to this the wild hyperinflation, the devaluation of savings, political instability, and maybe you'll get a sense of just how deep the mess was that the entire post-Soviet space found itself in. Although it's hard to describe this in words, for someone who didn't live through the 90s, it's difficult to grasp the spirit of that time. Another important point is that in the 90s there was a psychological breakdown in society, which had consequences that were no less destructive. For decades, Soviet propaganda worked to tarnish the image of businessmen and any kind of capitalist relations. And suddenly, everything that used to be strictly forbidden was not only allowed, but even encouraged. From high platforms and television screens, entrepreneurs began to be called the new elite. In an instant, the familiar ideas about values collapsed, and former Soviet people had to adapt to life in new conditions. Unfortunately, not everyone succeeded in this. These extreme conditions led to the rise of a new activity: entrepreneurship. Of course, commerce existed in the Soviet Union as well. For example, the same farsovщики or chekoviki, but it was illegal, and the number of people involved in it was small. But in the 90s, this activity became truly widespread. However, it should be understood that many people were drawn into business not out of greed, but because in essence, it was the only way to survive. Businessmen of the 90s. In the 90s, literally everyone rushed into entrepreneurship. Engineers and workers, military personnel and housewives, students and retirees. It's not surprising at all. As I already mentioned, for many people, this was the only way to earn a living. The most popular field of activity in those years was trade, ranging from small kiosks to large companies that imported all kinds of goods from abroad. Kiosks were really a mess. They were a distinctive sign of those turbulent times. They stood on almost every corner and sold anything: groceries, vodka, cigarettes, audio and video cassettes. In the 90s, new, previously unseen professions appeared in post-Soviet countries: money changers, shuttle traders, realtors, and stockbrokers. As if by the wave of a magic wand, clothing markets appeared in cities all over the former Soviet Union, with goods purchased in Turkey, Poland, China, and Greece. Their delivery was handled by so-called shuttle traders. In huge checkered bags, they carried jeans, sheepskin coats, fur coats, down jackets, dresses, cosmetics, and sometimes even household appliances across the borders. These bags became symbols of the post-Soviet era. Shuttle trading was simple, required little investment, and attracted thousands. Former nurses and teachers, PhDs, and military officers became market traders, trying to save their families from poverty this way. Huge markets appeared almost immediately, such as Cherkizon and Luzha in Moscow, Barabashovo in Kharkiv, or the 7th kilometer in Odessa. This type of entrepreneurship became so widespread that airlines started special flights for shuttle traders. By the end of the 90s, this type of activity gradually faded away. However, many future stars of post-Soviet business started their careers as shuttle traders. In the early 90s, Ukraine had a unique group of shuttle traders. They didn't bring consumer goods from abroad. On the contrary, they took goods to Eastern European countries, mainly to Poland and Romania. It was all sorts of things: tools, watches, optical devices, fishing gear, cameras. However, the main source of income was smuggling alcohol and cigarettes across the border. In the early 1990s, people were finally allowed to have foreign currency and conduct currency transactions. That was a time of hyperinflation. Therefore, dollars and marks served not only as the basis for personal savings, but were also used as a means of settlement between businessmen. Often, goods prices were listed directly in United States dollars. It's no surprise that in the early 90s, so-called money changers appeared in post-Soviet cities, people from whom you could always buy or sell currency. They made decent money, but this type of business was quite dangerous, because money changers were often attacked, although the money changers themselves didn't miss a chance to scam a gullible customer. In the 90s, housing privatization began, which led to the emergence of another profession: realtors. They existed in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics too, but back then, their activities were considered illegal. The profession quickly became popular because it didn't require any special knowledge or financial investment, yet it brought in quite a substantial income. In the 90s, black market realtors emerged, forming connections with notaries and law enforcement to seize apartments from elderly people, alcoholics, drug addicts, and those with disabilities. In the Soviet Union, a foreign car was about as accessible as a spaceship, but in 1991, everything changed. Private individuals were allowed to import cars from abroad. That's how another profession was born: the used car transporter from Europe. It provided a good income, but it was extremely dangerous. Bandits literally hunted down the transporters, trying to get their hands on the money or the vehicle. Drivers often just disappeared without a trace, and mass graves were found along the transport routes. In the 1990s, the first commodity and stock exchanges appeared rapidly across the post-Soviet region, often set up in unexpected places like university buildings, factory workshops, pavilions, exhibition centers, and even private apartments. After trading at the exchange in the evenings, they could hold a disco, but no one cared since the exchanges generated huge profits for their owners. For example, German Sterlinghoff, the founder and owner, 6 million rubles. The rooms were simply packed with bags of large denomination bills. However, his happiness was brief. By late 1991, the exchange's turnover fell and it soon went bankrupt. Another popular and profitable type of commercial activity in the 90s was selling audio and video cassettes with pirated content. A variation of this were video salons, which began to open in the late Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and after its collapse they flourished even more. Cassettes with Western movies were extremely popular, and it was thanks to them that an entire generation of Soviet citizens got their first, albeit rather peculiar, introduction to Western culture. The gangster 90s. Any activity related to making money carries serious risks, and in the 90s those risks were especially high, if not outright extreme. This period is characterized by the rise of crime, which saw business as its feeding ground. Organized crime was already taking money from underground entrepreneurs during the Soviet era. But that was minor compared to the early 90s, when gangsters dominated the entire economy of the post-Soviet space. Men with goatees in leather jackets and raspberry blazers were as iconic of those wild years as the shuttle traders. In a few years, many organized crime groups gained control over nearly all entrepreneurs, splitting areas of influence. They didn't care if it was Nalarek or a big company. They demanded tribute from everyone. Those who refused to pay were dealt with harshly and publicly, as an example to others. The 1990s scariest stories involve organized crime. However, it should be said that the respected guys didn't just collect money from businessmen, but actually solved many problems as well. The gangsters could deal with the rampant scams back then or resolve issues with government agencies, since going to court or law enforcement made no sense at that time. Financial pyramids like MMM and others. For those who lived in the 90s, the word pyramid is forever associated with a man named Sergei Mavrodi and the three letters MMM. But there were dozens, if not hundreds of them, and all of them were engaged in siphoning money from trusting citizens. Financial pyramids operated very simply. Their participants received income from the contributions of new members. In other words, only those investors who joined the pyramid early could expect to get any money. At the very beginning, the rest had no chance. Yesterday's Soviet citizens had no idea how a market economy worked. They truly believed in the crazy interest rates promised to them by scammers. The infamous MMM swindled money from millions of citizens, and there was also Copper Invest, Tibet, Vlastelina, and dozens, if not hundreds, of smaller ones. The most interesting thing is that when Mavrodi was finally arrested, numerous rallies swept across Russia where investors demanded his release. Overall, protests by deceived investors are another hallmark of the 1990s. Financial pyramids peaked in the early 1990s with their boom fading by decade's end. How did business work in the 1990s? Entrepreneurs' daily lives in the 1990s differed greatly from today for many reasons. After the Soviet Union collapsed, many people started businesses because they had no other options. They had neither experience nor knowledge, no business schools or specialized universities. None of that existed. People didn't even understand the basics of running a business, so even good ideas were often ruined by poor management. The judicial and law enforcement systems were frankly ineffective, so disputes and conflicts were settled in person, and these meetings often had an obviously criminal nature. Sauna gatherings were highly respected, where with the help of strong drinks and women of easy virtue, even the most complicated business matters were resolved. For successful business in the 90s, it was important to have serious informal connections among the criminal world, law enforcement, and a bit later, high-ranking officials. In those years, even ordinary businessmen gladly copied the style and manners of the mob, as that was the trend. Any self-respecting businessman of that time had a crimson jacket in his wardrobe, a set of gold chains, and a Rolex watch, often a fake one. When a businessman in the 90s became successful, he would get himself a bodyguard built like a wardrobe, or even two. He may have gotten a personal weapon even sooner. That's how things were back then. A distinctive feature of companies in the 90s was the large number of fields a single company could be involved in, such as food products, office equipment, lumber sales, funeral services, and retail. However, the success of companies in those years was often short-lived. Lacking experience, they often went bankrupt. In those years, there was absolutely no business culture, and the concept of business reputation didn't exist. Everyone wanted to make money as quickly as possible, so there was a huge amount of fraud in the business environment. If there was an opportunity, entrepreneurs would deceive each other, not pay for delivered goods, not repay loans, and not fulfill their obligations. The attitude toward consumers was worse. Selling them low-quality goods wasn't seen as shameful at all. However, all this negativity was offset by a huge empty market that eagerly absorbed any goods or services. Differences between a businessman of the 90s and a modern entrepreneur. And finally, a few words about the visual aspect. The main differences in the image of a modern business person compared to their counterpart from the wild 90s. Appearance. Looking good, showing off is more valuable than money. This saying from that era perfectly characterizes the approach businessmen took to shaping their own image. A crimson jacket, a chain as thick as a finger, and an expensive watch. That's the classic look. But is it of a Ukrainian or a Russian, immortalized in the folklore of that time? Of course, not everyone acted that way, but back then, there really were a lot of people in business who loved to put on a show. However, when reading about golden loaves and universities, our officials realized that the glorious traditions of the 90s haven't completely faded into the past. It's unlikely that a modern businessman would think of showing up to a business meeting dressed like that. Today, expensive suits, either custom-made or bought from high-end brand boutiques, have become the official attire of business. Many entrepreneurs actually prefer jeans and sneakers, especially those who work in the information technology field. The lifestyle of entrepreneurs in the 1990s can hardly be called healthy. Rarely did a business meeting go without alcohol, so having a strong liver was an important competitive advantage. Businessmen spent their free time in bars or restaurants where they certainly weren't drinking milkshakes. In addition, in the 90s it was fashionable to smoke, and businessmen, due to constant stress, smoked like chimneys, which of course didn't do any favors for their health. Today, a healthy lifestyle is in fashion. That's why you're more likely to find a modern businessman on a treadmill or in the gym than in a bar with a glass of whiskey. Being in good shape is seen as a sign of success, while bad habits are viewed as outdated. And the most popular stimulating drink is a cup of good coffee, along with credit cards and cash. In the 90s, a successful businessman often carried a thick wad of dollar bills in his pocket. Such an attribute also had a practical meaning, since many deals back then were unofficial and agreements were made based on mutual understanding. Now the world is moving away from cash, so plastic cards have replaced wads of dollars in businessmen's pockets. Credit cards can now be used to pay in stores anywhere in the world or to order goods online. Office equipment, video conferencing devices. A distinctive feature of a successful businessman's office in the 1990s was a large amount of bulky office equipment, computers, fax machines, and copiers. Several less competent but attractive long-legged secretaries also symbolized the company's status and success. Today, to do business, all you need is a tablet or a laptop, and high-speed internet allows you to work and hold meetings remotely from anywhere in the world. A few words in conclusion. The 1990s were challenging yet interesting and promising for most people in the former Soviet Union. This era rolled over like a heavy steamroller, but for the most active and enterprising citizens, it helped them find their place in the new reality. Could the 1990s have been different, less damaging for the post-Soviet space? Most likely no, because the changes brought by the collapse of the communist system were just too drastic. But as we know, history doesn't recognize the subjunctive mood. That's all from me for now.